Why hasn't it been possible to contain the nuclear energy and substances generated by the nuclear reactor explosions in Chernobyl? Well, the Soviets helped repair the damage, but there is still remaining radiation. Nuclear plants were created to provide a safer and permanent structure for nuclear power. But anyways, nuclear power is not safe, it's not clean, and it's very expensive. Nuclear power emits radioactive substances that can be harmful for humans. There have been established some limits to release radioactivity from nuclear plants, but it's still very difficult to detect low levels of radiation, and it's very expensive and difficult to contain and keep radioactivity and nuclear power.
What is that makes nuclear energies to be so dangerous? Nuclear energy can cause meltdowns like the one in Chernobyl. It releases enormous amounts of radiation into the surrounding communities, forcing hundreds of thousands of people to evacuate. Many of them may never come back. If the industry's current track record is any indication, we can expect a major meltdown about once per decade. The Chernobyl accident released a plume of radioactive materials into the atmosphere in a fraction of a second. Radiation is known to cause cancer in humans. Radiation can also cause mutations and other adverse health effects, including genetic defects in the children of exposed parents or mental retardation in the children of mothers exposed during pregnancy. In the following years, the incidence of thyroid cancer among those exposed as children increased in Ukraine and nearby countries. The cancer showed up between 4 and 10 years after the incident.
In nuclear reaction, it is the subatomic particles in the atomic nucleus, the neutrons and the protons, that rearrange themselves to form new elements or isotopes with more stable nuclei. The energy released by the reaction in the form of kinetic energy and electromagnetic energy is 1,000,000 times greater. A nuclear chain reaction is the process where neutrons released in fusion produce an additional fusion in at least one further nucleus. The nucleus in turn produces neutrons, and the process repeats, making neutrons, releasing each time 2 more neutrons, so the number of fusions doubles each time.
When will all the nuclear energy and substances released by this explosion be dissolved, and can they be cleaned out completely? What I found out was that most of the radioactive materials have transformed into stable, non-radioactive materials, but some will remain radioactive for a long time. The levels of radiation have been decreasing through the years, but have stayed in mainly open surfaces of urban areas. Mark Layanilla, life science contributor, says that because of the long-lived radiation in the region surrounding the former Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the area won't be safe for human habitation for at least 20,000 years. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a possibility for it to be cleaned out completely.
The exponential growth function is a G-shaped line, showing the increase of the value. Like its name says, the exponential growth cannot go negative nor a value of 0, so the asymptote is located at j equals 0. If the asymptote is something that you can reach nor pass, so the range for these functions are from 0 to infinity. And the domain are from negative infinite to infinite, or simply all real numbers. In these kinds of graphs, the characteristic point is located at 0,1.
After watching the 3 videos about the Chernobyl disaster, this is what we learned about this disaster. So, the explosion happened on Saturday, 26th of April, 1986. It was the worst nuclear accident in history. In the control room of the power plant, it was where everything was monitored and where they controlled the power of the reactants. But the reactant that they were working with was number 4. So there were 3 men, 3 engineers in control of everything. There were a lot of more staff, but 3 were the ones who were monitoring everything. There was one authority who was the chief, the supervisor, called Anatoly Dyatlov. So everything started when 2 engineers were discussing in what level of power was safe to begin the test with. And there was also 2 things that no one knew about, not the staff, not the engineers, no one, not even the authority, knew that there was a very fatal flaw in the reactor number 4 designed, and the engineers didn't know anything about it, and also that the man in charge, Anatoly Dyatlov, was seeking for technology that was very risky. So, even though the engineers were worried about the number of the power they had because they were supposed to work to begin the test with a reactor number 4 having a power of 700 megawatts, but they had 200. So, even though they were worried about running the power, Anatoly Taitov, the authority, was ignoring it. The test was supposed to happen between 700 and 1000 watts, but they had only 200 watts. But Anatoly believed that it will be a small risk, not that big a risk. So Anatoly told his men to pull the control rods, which meant the engineers won't be able to apply the brakes of the reactant if they wanted to stop anything. This was so the number of the megawatts will increase a little more because suddenly it was a number very low. So another reason why nobody spoke up was about the megawatts, that it was a very low number. It was supposed to be 700, is because the fear of losing their job of being nuclear engineers. Because in that time and in Russia, it was the best job you could have, and all the good things that it came about it, and your family living in that town called Privia, which was it was a privilege living there and having that job. So nobody wanted to speak up because they were fearing that they will lose the job. So without anyone noticing, the steam pressure in the reactant started to raise and raise because of the lack of water, and also because there was a lot of energy building up, making it a ticking bomb. Then the steam pressure inside the core of the reactor started lifting up 350 kilo caps to the fuel rods out. So the things that were there in the reactant, they were very heavy, started to lift out. Then the steam pressure in the reactors couldn't be contained anymore. That's when the explosion happened. The explosion blasted 50 tons of nuclear fuel into the atmosphere, and 700 tons of radioactive graphite were blown around the planet. In the town where this was happening, it was only 1 mile away from Genelov, so everybody who worked on the power station lived there, and after the accident, they all had to evacuate. So after the accident, a lot of deaths, a lot of burns, a lot of people getting sick because of the radioactive activity that was happening. They were all evacuated, and over all the city, and over 60,000 Soviet men and women were sent to Privia to contain the radioactivity in order to safeguard all around the world. Another consequence of what happened was that there were 10,000 cancers in Russia and 25,000 cancers worldwide over a 70-year period. And this is the consequences and the mistakes that I mentioned before that made the Chernobyl disaster happen. An example of exponential growth are the street dogs. Why? Because of all the dogs who are in the street of a town, of a city, or wherever you live in, all those dogs who don't have an owner, who don't have someone who takes care of them, controls them, all those dogs, all they do is reproduce. So they just reproduce and reproduce. So all those dogs who are street dogs who have rabies just keep on reproducing and reproducing and growing the problem. This is why it's an exponential growth, which is a problem. And also a very important consequence about this exponential growth is that as the street dog number keeps increasing, also the rabies that they spread. And more than 55,000 people die of rabies each year, specifically in Africa and in Asia. So this is exponential growth because it just keeps growing and growing, and nothing is stopping it, nothing is delaying the growth. So it's just something that it's a number, it just keeps multiplying and multiplying, because even though dogs die, they just reproduce even more. So it's a number that it never gets lower, it just gets bigger. And also another example of exponential growth is debt. That debt even has its own formula, which is this one, which is D for depth, C for the depth at the time that you own, T for time, and K is for the growth constant, and E is the E in the calculator. So why is depth at exponential growth? Because of something you have a depth of something. That number, even though it's a little number, because of all the interest, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And because of all the time you take to pay the debt, that debt just keeps growing and growing and growing, and you just keep owning more money, and you can't pay the money. So the exponential growth, that as what talks, it just keeps growing and growing, and nothing is delaying it because it's just a number that keeps multiplying, and that's why it's an exponential growth.
Exponential growth. It's a growth whose rate becomes even more rapid in proportion to the growing total number of size. It has a specific function. Exponential growth can occur very rapidly or very slowly, but at a certain rate and always increasing. In the other side, exponential decay is the opposite of exponential growth. It's a rate that becomes less in proportion to the decreasing number.
What are the implications of using nuclear energy? Do you consider nuclear energy to be clean energy? As of today, nuclear energy is considered as one of the most environmentally friendly sources of energy as it produces fewer greenhouse gases emissions during the production of electricity as compared to traditional sources like coal power plants. While being environmental friendly is the big plus of nuclear energy, disposal of radioactive waste and protecting people and environment from its radiations is a big cons of nuclear energy. Nuclear energy in a way helps the environment, but in another way it affects it. Pros of nuclear energy: low pollution, low operating costs, reliability, more proficient than fossil fuels, base load energy. Cons of nuclear energy: environmental impact, radioactive waste disposal, nuclear accidents, high costs, hot targets for militants.
We are aware that there are two nuclear energy plants in Mexico, one in Mexico City and the other one in La Burda Verde Power Station on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico in Alto Lucero, Veracruz. We do think it is safe, and we agree with the fact that there is nuclear energy plant in Mexico due to the fact that many other countries practice this nuclear energy, and even though we do not have to actually put it in use, it is good to have the knowledge of having this. We think that Mexico has done a good job managing their nuclear power since the country has pledged to use this technology for peaceful purposes.
Could the Chernobyl 1986 nuclear disaster have been prevented? How? Properly designed process controls could have prevented the meltdown at Chernobyl. Bela Liptak, Hungarian engineer, said that it occurred at night after a shift change of operators who were poorly trained, uninformed, and were operating the plants under manual control while their safety controls were bypassed. Also, that the computer was disabled. The runway condition developed a power generation that reached over 100 times the design capacity and caused the steam explosion. The engineers didn't recognize that they were working with a very fast process. So mainly, all of this could have been prevented with better training and understanding of the engineers. Once the explosion happened, was there any way to stop the radiation spread and its pollution? There was definitely no way in stopping that huge explosion to spread. Do you think that the radioactive pollution generated by this disaster reached Mexico? No, it was only spread across Europe, but the world is certainly most safer now than before, respecting the safety of nuclear power. What are at least 4 environmental consequences of the Chernobyl 1986 disaster? More than 200,000 kilometers squared of Europe was contaminated. Many trees were damaged in their reproductive tissue. Plants and animals within 30 kilometers of the explosion received high levels of radiation. The animals and vegetation in affected forests and mountains are particularly contaminated. And Chernobyl deposited on rivers, lakes, and some water reservoirs, which obviously affected the flora and fauna there too.
The environmental consequences in a global scale of other nuclear disasters and use of weapons.
We think that nuclear power can be used in a positive way when they are used properly. But we think they should be used with limitations and considering all the risks they can cause. They also have to be used properly to prevent all the consequences they can cause. And we think They should not be used for bad purposes because they can cause death and destruction.
What would be a solution proposal for this situation? Nuclear power plants have multiple safety measures, which are designed on the assumption they must ensure the safety of neighboring communities so that there will be no adverse impacts on their health. Nuclear power plants are designed to prevent abnormal incidents from occurring. Even if abnormal incidents occur, nuclear plants are also designed to prevent the potential spreading of abnormal incidents and leakage of radioactive materials around plants, which may cause adverse impacts on the surrounding environment. Some nuclear power plants utilize redundant safety measures to keep residential communities around them safe at all times. Measures to be put into action in order to ensure safety during unusual events can be summarized in the following three major points. 1. To shut down operating reactors. 2. To cool down reactors so as to remove heat from nuclear fuel. 3. To contain radioactive materials.
We thought it was fun to interact with other classrooms and get to know each other, but this challenge was definitely a hard one due to the fact that we had to coordinate different times of working and different methods of working. In all, we really liked the fact that we got to meet each other and that we got to hear other points of views and other opinions, and it ended up being a really good job. We feel like that working like this was a challenge, but it was definitely a fun challenge.